In the heart of winter, 1889, a train quietly pulled into a small town called Willow Creek, where icy winds whipped against the old wooden church, and the distant chime of bells lingered in the frosty air. Stepping off that train was a tall, broad-shouldered man named Eli Turner. So tall he had to bend his head every time he walked through a doorway. In his hand was a letter of betrothal, and in his heart a fragile hope that in this unfamiliar place he might finally find a home. But the moment his mail-order bride saw him, she burst into laughter and walked away in front of everyone, leaving Eli standing alone in the falling snow, surrounded by the mocking stares of the entire station. If it were you rejected just because you were different, what would you do? Would you walk away in shame, or would you stay and prove your true worth? Eli didn't know it then, but his decision to remain in Willow Creek that day would lead him on a journey that would change his life forever and teach him, and all of us, what love really means. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts, and let's step together into this heartfelt story. The train pushed its way through the thick morning fog of winter, 1890. The iron wheels screeched against the rails, slow, steady like the heartbeat of a weary soul still trying to believe that somewhere ahead, hope was waiting. Jonas Hale, an unusually tall man, nearly 2 meters, sat quietly by the carriage window. Pale winter light brushed across his sunburnt, hardened face. In his hand was a creased letter, written in the delicate slanted handwriting of a woman named Miss Abigail Moore, someone he had never met, yet someone who had promised him a home, a new beginning, in a place called Cedar Hollow, Wyoming. Jonas came from the east, where he worked at a lumber mill along the Hudson River. But after the accident that took his best friend's life, he lost everything: his home, his job, and the belief that he could ever be needed by anyone again. A friend told him about marriage by mail, where frontier women searched for husbands, and lonely men searched for hope. Jonas didn't expect much. All he wanted was a place to rest, and a voice that called him home at the end of the day. Inside the train, people chatted noisily about newly found gold mines, about missing cattle, about a snowstorm on its way. Only Jonas remained silent. His large hand rested on the letter, gently brushing it, as if touching his last fragile thread of hope. If you truly want to build a home, I will wait for you in Cedar Hollow. I don't need much, just a kind man. Abigail's words made him smile faintly. After years of people staring at him with wary eyes because of his unusual height, Jonas dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, God was finally leading him where he was meant to be. Cedar Hollow appeared through the mist, a small town nestled in a valley. A wooden church, a clinic, a general store, and a few half-finished red brick houses. The wind howled through wooden fences. Horses neighed. Children laughed somewhere nearby. Life here didn't seem to know rush or luxury, only red earth, cold wind, and people trying to plant their roots in the wild. Jonas stepped onto the platform. He had to lower his head so he wouldn't hit the low roof. People turned to stare curious eyes, and a few children giggling behind mittened hands. Jonas smiled back, though his heart pounded hard in his chest. Then he saw her, a woman in a gray cloak, standing beside a wagon. Abigail Moore. He walked toward her, the weight of his old wooden suitcase heavy in his hand, yet his heart strangely light. He didn't know what to say first, so he simply stopped a few steps away and spoke softly. I'm Jonas Hale, the man you wrote to, from Hudson. Abigail looked up. In her eyes flashed something: surprise, then hesitation, and finally, disappointment. She glanced at him from head to toe, her lips pressing into a thin line. In the cold morning air, Her smile faded like breath on glass. Jonas didn't understand, but he could feel it, the invisible wall rising between them. She turned away, her voice small but clear. "I didn't think you'd be this tall. We don't have any bed big enough for you here." Around them, a few people snickered. A middle-aged man called out mockingly, "Maybe he should go to the church. He's too big for a bride." Jonas stood still. The wind blew his wide-brimmed hat off into the snow. He didn't pick it up, just lowered his head. That familiar feeling washed over him again, being stripped bare in front of strangers, turned into a joke, a feeling he thought he had left behind. But in that very moment, rather than anger, he only heard the distant sound of wagon wheels rolling away, and inside him, something quietly broke, not despair, but a realization. Maybe God wasn't ready to give him a home just yet. At least, not today. He bent down, picked up his hat, brushed off the thin layer of snow. In front of him, a small wooden sign swayed in the wind. Cedar Hollow Church, Reverend Charles Brooks. Jonas looked at it, and in his eyes, a faint light flickered of someone who still hadn't given up. Maybe he wasn't welcomed the way he hoped. But perhaps only those who have been rejected truly understand the meaning of staying, of beginning again. No one knew that, on that cold morning when the wind swept across Cedar Hollow Station, and Abigail's smile disappeared, a different story. Quietly began the story of a man too tall to be loved, yet strong enough to teach an entire town what kindness truly means. In every human journey, there is always a moment when hope is tested not by grand tragedies, but by a quiet wound, delivered in public, under the eyes of the world. For Jonas Hale, that moment happened on the platform of Cedar Hollow Station, just as snow began to fall soft as ash. Abigail Moore, the woman he believed would greet him with a smile, now stood only a few steps away, but in her eyes, he saw a wall being built. She wasn't harsh. She didn't speak loudly. It was the way she whispered, shaken, quiet, that made her rejection sharper than any shout could ever be. "You're too tall," she said, voice small yet ringing in the cold air. "People here will stare. I just can't." That single sentence so short came crashing down on everything he had carried across 1,000 miles. Jonas stood still. Snow gathered on his shoulders, on his old wooden suitcase. He bowed his head, tried to smile to save the last bits of his dignity, but the corners of his lips trembled. A group of men waiting for the next train burst into laughter. Their laughter wasn't loud, but it was enough to tear apart the silence around the station. One of them said, half joking, half cruel, maybe he should find work in a circus, not as somebody's husband. The crowd roared. Children pointed. An old woman shook her head and pulled her shawl tighter. And in the middle of it all, Jonas, tall, awkward, kind-hearted, became a spectacle. He wanted to walk away, wanted to shout that he came here only because he believed in a promise, in a small dream like anyone else. But his throat closed up. He only bent down, picked up his hat that the wind had knocked into the snow, gently brushed it off, and placed it back on his head, like nothing had happened. Abigail had already turned her back. The sound of her boots against the snow was cold as a sentence passed. She climbed onto the wagon without a glance back. It rolled away, kicking up a trail of pale snow behind it. Jonas remained where he was. No more laughter, only the wind whistling through the wooden fences, and the distant church bell tolling, lonely and low. A stray dog wandered over, sniffed his coat, then left. The world seemed so still he could almost hear the earth sigh. He looked up. Most people had left. Only the station master, an old man with silver hair named Mr. Grant Porter, was still there, shoveling snow off the steps. He walked toward Jonas, his gaze gentle, touched with sympathy. "You're Jonas Hale, aren't you?" Jonas nodded, unable to speak. "Well, I heard you came to meet Miss Abigail. Small-town news travels quick." He sighed softly. "Don't let their words break you. There's a place you can stay tonight, if you'd like." Jonas lifted his eyes. "I don't want to trouble anyone." "Sir? Mr.?" Porter smiled, laid a hand on his shoulder. "This is the frontier. Son, out here, we don't call it trouble. We call it getting through together. Simple words, but like a door opening when all that's left around you are walls. Mr. Porter led Jonas across the frost-covered road toward the small church on the hill where Reverend Charles Brooks, the aging pastor, often gave shelter to travelers when the weather turned bitter. As they walked, they passed small wooden houses, blue smoke curling from chimneys, the faint smell of cornbread drifting in the air. Jonas said nothing, only listened to the crunch of his footsteps mixing with the sound of the wind. The shame was still there, but beneath it, something smoldered, like embers beneath ash. A quiet longing to prove he wasn't born into this world just to be laughed at. When they reached the church steps, Reverend Brooks opened the door. He looked Jonas up and down, not shocked, not curious, just nodded, as if he'd known this man would come. "Welcome, my son," he said, voice low and warm. "God doesn't send anyone here without a reason." Jonas bowed his head in thanks. The Reverend showed him to a small storage room in the back, usually used for tools. But tonight, it would be his home. In the dim light, the cracked walls and creaky wooden bed still carried a strange sense of peace. That night, Jonas did not sleep. He sat by the small window, watching snow drift down, thinking about the long journey, about the letter that no longer meant anything, and about the way Abigail's eyes made him feel like some strange creature. But through all the thoughts, he still heard the church bell ringing in the night deep, steady like a message that maybe tomorrow could be different. In the quiet, he made a promise to himself. "I don't want pity. I'll work. I'll survive. And if even one person looks at me with honesty, just once I'll show them that a person's worth isn't in their height, but in their heart." And just like a small winter miracle, when every door seems closed sometimes, God opens another one. Simple, warm, where quiet kindness waits for us to walk through. That night, the sky over Cedar Hollow felt like it was covered by a thick blanket of lead. Wind hissed through the bare birch trees, slipping into the small window where Jonas Hale sat in silence. He still wasn't used to being taken in, grateful, yet feeling like a burden. But the slow, steady toll of the church bell eased something inside him. The storage room behind the church held nothing but an old wooden bed, a dim oil lamp, and the scent of dust and candle wax. Reverend Charles Brooks, the gentle-eyed minister, had told him, "If you feel cold, add more wood to the stove. Here, no one has to prove they deserve shelter. You only need to not lose faith." Jonas didn't respond. He only nodded, his eyes full of quiet thanks. After all the mocking voices at the train station, such simple kindness felt like being warmed from the inside out. The next morning, just as the sun brushed the distant mountains, Jonas was already awake. He heard the wind seeping through the cracks in the wall, carrying the damp smell of melting snow. Outside, the Reverend was sweeping snow off the church steps. Jonas stepped out, his large hand wrapping around the handle of a shovel. "Reverend, let me help." "You don't have to." "I want to," Jonas said softly. I don't want to just be someone staying here for free." The Reverend looked at him and smiled. "Then let's do it together." They shoveled snow until the sun rose high. Then the Reverend pointed toward the old wooden bell tower. "I've been meaning to fix that, but my hands aren't what they used to be. If you truly want to help, you could start there." Jonas looked up. The wind rattled the small tarnished bell. The rope was almost torn in half. He nodded and walked over. His years at the Hudson River lumber mill had taught him how buildings were put together, so before long, he was climbing the wooden frame, carefully replacing each rotten plank. At first, the townsfolk passing by only glanced. Then someone whispered, "That's the fella Abigail left at the station." There were snickers, headshakes, a few lingering stares. Jonas heard it all, but his hands kept working. With every strike of the hammer, it felt like he was nailing shut another crack inside his own heart. By noon, Mr. Grant Porter, the station master who brought him here, arrived with a sack of biscuits and steaming coffee. "You've got a good hand for this," he said, setting the bag on the step. "Told the Reverend he ought to keep you on. This church could use hands like yours." Jonas paused, sweat on his brow despite the cold. "I'm just working to earn my place to sleep, sir." "You can call me Grant," Porter chuckled. "And sometimes doing good work is the best way to repay kindness." Jonas smiled a real smile, the first one since he arrived in Cedar Hollow. He didn't know if anyone saw, but to him, that was proof enough that a wounded heart could heal again when treated with kindness. By late afternoon, sunlight fell across the bell tower, and the echo of hammer strikes drifted through the valley. A few children ran past and stopped to watch. A little blonde girl whispered, "Mister, are you a giant?" Jonas chuckled, voice rough. "No, sweetheart. I'm just a little taller than most. You look like the men in the stories, the ones who build bridges for whole towns." That innocent sentence stung his eyes with unexpected tears. He knelt down, nodding gently. "Maybe I'll try to be someone like that." That evening, Reverend Brooks stepped into the small room where Jonas stayed. He set down an old leather-bound Bible, its cover worn with age. "I'm not asking you to read it," he said, voice deep as the night wind. "But if there's ever a night you feel too lonely, open it to any page. You won't feel alone anymore." Jonas didn't speak, only nodded. After the Reverend left, he opened the book at random. The oil lamp flickered against faded ink, and his eyes stopped at one line. "Those whom the world rejects, I shall receive." His hand trembled slightly. Maybe God really was speaking to him. Night fell. Cedar Hollow sank into silence. A distant wolf howled somewhere in the mountains. But inside the little room, the oil lamp still burned, and the tall man sat there, quietly mending the frayed bell rope, each stitch patient, steady. Out there, the world might laugh at him, but here in this small church he had found something close to peace, and perhaps it was in that very moment that Jonas Hale truly began his journey, not to win love with words, but to reclaim his worth with his hands and his heart. In the days that followed, the sound of Jonas's hammer echoed every morning like the heartbeat of a man learning how to live again. He didn't know it yet, but with every cracked board he fixed, every nail he set, he was repairing something far more fragile: his own pride. Winter mornings in Cedar Hollow always began with the sound of wind lashing against wooden roofs and the church bell echoing through the mist. For Jonas Hale, that sound slowly became familiar, like the heartbeat of a life starting again from nothing. Every day, he rose before the sun peeked over the snow-capped mountains. He lit the fire in the church's old stove. then went outside to check for broken beams, loose shingles, cracked fences. Out here on the frontier, winter could kill a man if his home wasn't sturdy enough. And Jonas, with his calloused hands and quiet strength, helped mend rooftops, fix fence posts, replace windbell ropes. No one asked him to. He did it because he needed to feel that he still mattered. One morning, Reverend Brooks spotted him standing on the church roof, snow covering his shoulders, hammer striking in steady rhythm. The Reverend looked up and smiled gently. "Jonas," he called, "you don't need to work this hard. You've already paid your keep." Jonas paused, looked down, and said, his voice low but firm, "I'm not working to pay for a bed. Reverend, I'm working to prove I'm still a man." A simple sentence, yet it carved itself into the Reverend's heart. He only nodded and walked away. The townsfolk slowly grew used to the tall man, broad shoulders, slightly stooped posture so he wouldn't hit door frames, sun-worn face, and gentle eyes. At first, they called him the fellow Abigail left at the station, but after watching him work day after day without complaint, they started calling him something else, the church carpenter. By noon, children often came to watch him work. Jonas rarely talked, but he smiled, showing them how to hold a hammer, measure wood, and drive a nail without splitting the board. One thin boy named Samuel asked Mr. Jonas, "Aren't you sad when people laughed at you at the station?" Jonas placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice quiet but sure. "You know, Samuel, some laughter doesn't make us smaller. It just reminds us we're big enough not to have to answer it. In the evenings, when the bell tower turned gold in the setting sun, Jonas would sit by the church steps, cleaning his tools. Sometimes Grant Porter, the station master, stopped by with hot coffee or buttered bread. He'd look at the neatly stacked wood and repairs around the church and say, 'You know, Jonas, folks are talking about you now. They say there's a man from the east tall enough to touch the roof who's fixing not just this church, but its soul.' Jonas only smiled. 'I'm not fixing any souls, Grant, just things people forgot to care for.' And in that moment, though he didn't realize it, he was talking about himself too. Day after day, the small church began to change. The stove burned warmer. The roof no longer leaked. The bell rang clearer. Whenever the bell tolled, people paused, listening to its sound ripple through the valley and deep inside. They felt grateful for the man who brought it back to life. Yet even as respect for him grew, Jonas still avoided crowded places. He ate late, worked late, and slept only when the town had gone quiet, because inside him, the wound left on that train platform still felt like a scar not fully healed. One night, Reverend Brooks found him in the small workshop behind the church. Jonas was fixing a cracked window frame for the orphanage across the valley. The Reverend watched him for a moment before speaking. "You know, Jonas, some people come here to be saved, but some are sent here to save others. I don't know which one you are. Maybe both." Jonas looked up, emotion flickering in his eyes. "If I can save someone just with these hands, then maybe I still have worth, Reverend." The Reverend nodded. "Yes, and sometimes saving others is how we save ourselves." That night, Jonas left the workshop. Snow had begun to fall, covering the path to the bell tower in a soft white sheet. Moonlight struck the snow, casting his long shadow tall, solitary, quiet, but unbroken. He stood there for a moment and whispered to himself, "I don't need pity. I can work." From that day on, people saw Jonas everywhere in town, at the infirmary repairing broken windows, at the schoolhouse patching a leaking roof, at the home of an elderly widow chopping and stacking firewood without a word. He never asked for payment, whatever people offered. He accepted a meal, a blanket, a smile, and slowly, the name Jonas Hale no longer carried pity, but respect. Some say when a man works with all his heart, he doesn't just mend wood, stone, or broken bell ropes, he mends people's faith in kindness. And that is what Jonas did for Cedar Hollow. One early spring afternoon, while Jonas was fixing the orphanage fence, a gentle yet steady voice spoke from behind him, warm as the sunlight melting the last of the snow. He turned, and for the first time since arriving in Cedar Hollow, Jonas saw a pair of eyes that looked at him not with pity, but with understanding. It was an early spring afternoon, when the last of the winter snow was melting into thin streams across the earth. Jonas Hale was mending the wooden fence of the orphanage on the edge of town. Golden sunlight spilled across his shoulders, making the wood shavings glimmer like specks of gold. The scent of pine resin and the steady rhythm of hammer against wood blended with the distant laughter of children. That was when he heard a voice behind him, clear, yet worn in a way only someone who had known loss could sound, and still chose gentleness over bitterness. If you stand in the sun like that, the wood will crack before it even dries. Jonas turned. Standing before him was a woman in a simple brown dress, sleeves rolled up to reveal sun-browned skin and faint scars along her wrists. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, her hair tied back neatly. Her eyes were calm bright, like a lake after the storm. "You are?" he asked, a little unsure. "I'm Martha Collins." She replied with a small smile. "I take care of the children here. Reverend Brooks said you'd be helping with the fence. Yes, I'm just trying to make it a little safer for them." Martha bent down and picked up a piece of wood. Her fingers, scarred and calloused, traced the grain softly. Jonas noticed, but said nothing. He simply continued working. They stood side by side, barely speaking. Each carried their own silence, and strangely, those silences fit together without effort, without distance. When the final plank was nailed in place, Martha wiped her brow and looked around. "Looks good. I think the children will feel safer now. They've been afraid to go outside because of wolves. This should help." Jonas nodded, his eyes following a few kids tossing wooden balls in the yard. "I was one of them once," he murmured, "a scared kid, thinking I didn't belong anywhere." Martha looked at him, and her eyes softened. "Maybe all of us have thought that, at one time or another." That simple reply loosened something in his chest, as if someone had gently untied a knot he'd carried all the way to Cedar Hollow. They sat on the wooden steps in front of the orphanage. Martha handed him a cup of warm tea. Her hand trembled slightly when she poured. Those were the same hands burned in the fire 3 years ago, when she saved 5 children from the blaze. Her husband, Elias Collins, didn't survive. The whole town knew, but no one spoke of it. Jonas didn't ask. He only bowed his head, accepted the cup, and said thank you for the tea and for not looking at me the way others did. Martha smiled softly. "You think I've never felt those looks myself? In a place like this, people find it easier to pity than to understand. But I don't want pity. I just want someone to believe I still have something left to give." Jonas went still. He set the cup down, his rough hands clasped together. "I understand." Around them, wind drifted through the valley, carrying the faint scent of dried flowers. In the days that followed, Jonas often returned to the orphanage fixing roofs, rebuilding the horse shed, repairing the small bridge over the creek. And Martha quiet. Self-reliant, slowly grew accustomed to his presence. They never asked about each other's pasts, but in their eyes, Both recognized it. Each carried a deep wound, and both were still choosing to live, not run. One evening, as the sun was fading, Jonas was on the roof patching a leak while Martha stood below and called up, "I heard people say you came here because of a mail-order marriage. Is that true?" Jonas paused. The wind tousled the hair across his forehead. "It's true," he answered calmly. "But maybe she was right to turn me away. I don't blame her. Why not? Because if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here, and I wouldn't have met honest people." Martha didn't reply, but for the first time, Jonas saw something new in her eyes, not just calmness, but gratitude. That night, when Reverend Brooks came to check on the repairs, he found the two of them sitting on the steps, speaking quietly. The Reverend smiled and said to Grant Porter, who was beside him, I believe, "Some scars can only heal when another pair of hands knows how to listen." Grant nodded, eyes fixed on the pair in the fading light. Jonas has begun to smile. "Reverend, I think the Lord is at work." From that day on, the townsfolk no longer called Jonas that tall fellow who got left at the station. They called him the church carpenter, or the man who helps at the orphanage. And Martha, the woman with the scarred hands, became known as the one who brought a smile back to the giant. Though nothing was spoken out loud, everyone felt it. Something was quietly taking root between them. Not pity, not charity, but something honest, simple like spring, after a very long winter. Their story grew quietly, like green shoots beneath the earth. And when Cedar Hollow decided to rebuild the old bell tower, the symbol that had been silent for years, it was Jonas who stepped forward first to take on the task. No one knew that the tower would become more than wood and stone. It would stand as proof of a faith being rebuilt by a man and a woman who chose to believe again. Early summer brought a gentle stir to Cedar Hollow. Barley fields began to head with pale grain. Children ran freely under the soft sunlight, and men gathered in the small square before the town hall. That day was the annual town meeting where they discussed fixing the roads, restoring the well, and most importantly, rebuilding the old bell tower. That bell tower had once been the heart of Cedar Hollow. But after the storm 3 years ago, it collapsed, leaving only moss-covered stone and silence. The bell lay cracked, the wooden frame splintered, and people let it rest like a wound no one wished to touch. When Reverend Brooks brought up the topic at the meeting, no one spoke. Funds were scarce. The carpenters were busy with the harvest season. No one wanted to take on such heavy, seemingly hopeless work. Across the room, leaning quietly against a wooden post, stood Jonas Hale, arms folded. He hadn't intended to speak until he heard someone mutter, half joking, half cruel, "If the church giant wants to make up for scaring the children with his shadow, now's a good time." Scattered laughter followed. Reverend Brooks frowned, but before he could say a word, Jonas stepped forward. "I'll do it," he said, voice low and steady. "I have the tools. I'll rebuild the bell tower for free." Silence fell across the room. Eyes turned toward him, some surprised, some skeptical. A man in a brown hat asked, "You sure you know what you're saying? That ain't no fence repair, mister." Jonas met his gaze. "I know. I don't ask for payment, just someone to help haul the lumber." Reverend Brooks stood and placed a hand on Jonas's shoulder. "Then we do it together. Jonas, and if you can raise that bell tower again, maybe this town will learn how to believe in good things again." From that day, the work began. Jonas pitched a small tent beside the crumbled foundation. He measured, sawed, sanded, and set the frame. Every afternoon, Martha Collins brought him lunch dark bread, a cup of bean stew, sometimes a few apples. He didn't speak much, she didn't ask much, but every time she arrived, he looked up and smiled. Weeks passed. Men who once mocked him began stopping by, offering to help for a few hours. Samuel, the thin boy who followed him like a shadow, learned to pull ropes, measure beams, align joints. Slowly, timber rose against the pale sky, straight and strong. One afternoon, Martha sat under the shade of a tree watching him work. His shirt was soaked with sweat, but his movements remained steady. Calm, she said softly, more to herself than to him. They can't call you a giant anymore. Jonas. Not when you're rebuilding the town's faith. Jonas looked down from the scaffold, his eyes gentle. I just want to hear that bell again. Miss Martha. When it rings, I'll know I truly belong here. As days passed, more townsfolk came. Some brought water, some brought tools, some brought nothing but their company. Laughter replaced mockery. People started calling him Jonas of Cedar Hollow. At last, after more than 2 months, the bell tower stood complete. On a clear Sunday morning, the entire town gathered below it. Reverend Brooks prayed, and then placed the new bell rope stitched by Jonas's own hands into his grasp. Jonas looked around. Faces that once sneered now shone with pride. Martha stood beside the Reverend, her eyes warm, like morning sunlight. He bowed his head, tightened his grip, and pulled. The bell rang, deep, clear, lasting. Its sound rolled across the valley, stirring something in every heart, not just faith, but forgotten kindness. An old woman made the sign of the cross, hands trembling. Children cheered, and Samuel shouted louder than all of them. He did it. Mr. Jonas made the bell sing again. Jonas looked up at the tower gleaming in the light. His eyes glistened, not with shame this time, but with peace. He had found where he belonged, not through promises, but through his hands and his heart. As the ceremony ended, Martha stepped forward and handed him a white handkerchief. For the sweat, she said quietly. He took it. Their hands brushed. They didn't say more. They just stood side by side, watching the bell sway in the sunlight. From that day on, the bell of Cedar Hollow no longer rang just for prayer. Each time it sounded, Martha would pause and listen, and Jonas would lift his head from the forge and smile, somewhere between the ring of the bell and the scent of hot iron. Something was growing quiet, steady, like love between two souls who once believed they were unworthy of being loved. From the day the bell of Cedar Hollow rang for the first time, something in the town changed. People spoke a little softer. They smiled a little more, even on cold mornings. When the wind cut through the street and someone heard the bell echoing in the distance, they would pause just for a moment, as if listening to their own hearts. As for Jonas Hale, after months of labor, he settled back into a simple rhythm of life. He still helped Reverend Brooks repair the church, sometimes forged knives or built shelves for the townsfolk, and every Saturday evening he walked to the orphanage where Martha Collins taught the children songs. One evening, just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, Martha asked Jonas to climb to the top of the newly built bell tower. I want to see how far your bell can travel, she said, a small light of joy in her eyes. Jonas agreed. They climbed the narrow wooden stairs, each step creaking softly under their weight. The wind was stronger at the top, carrying the scent of dry grass and chimney smoke from distant homes. When they reached the peak, the last pale gold light of day washed over the town. Below them lay all of Cedar Hollow, tiny roofs, a silver creek winding through the valley, and children running in the fields below. Martha rested her hand on the wooden railing and whispered, "I didn't think the bell tower would be this beautiful. You didn't just build a structure. Jonas, you gave this town back its faith." Jonas said nothing for a moment. The wind tousled his hair as he turned to her and spoke quietly. "I only wanted to do something good. Sometimes, when you have nothing left to hold on to, the only thing that keeps you in this world is a kind act." Martha gave a sad, gentle smile. "You talk like I've never thought the same." Jonas looked at her hands sun-browned, scarred, yet always gentle when brushing a child's hair or passing a cup of water. "I know," he said softly. "You understand it better than anyone." In that moment, words no longer mattered. Only the wind, the bell, and the sunset wove a quiet kind of peace around them. Martha looked up, her eyes shimmering. "Jonas, do you ever think that those who've lost the most are the ones who can love the deepest?" After a long silence, he answered, "I think only those who know pain can truly cherish what they're given. But I don't know if I can love the way people talk about. Why? Because I'm used to being seen as different. I'm afraid that if someone gets too close, they'll see something that makes them leave." Martha turned to face him. Her voice was soft, but steady. "I already see it. Jonas." He froze. She held his gaze. "And I'm still here." A gust of wind swept past, lifting the edge of her shawl. Without thinking, Jonas reached out to catch it. His hand brushed against hers, rough, warm, real. Neither of them pulled away. They just looked at one another, in the fading light of the day. Below, Reverend Brooks was locking the church doors. He glanced up and saw two silhouettes standing atop the bell tower. He smiled, a soft mist of breath leaving his lips in the cold air. "Lord," he murmured, "they found each other." From that day on, people often saw Jonas and Martha together, teaching the children to cut wood, painting the church gate, planting wildflowers around the bell tower. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt something growing between them, quiet, natural, like spring after a long winter. In the evenings, when the wind swept across the fields, Martha would stop by the blacksmith workshop, bringing Jonas a hand-stitched cloth or a plate of warm cornbread, and each time he heard her knock, he washed his hands in a hurry, wiped the sweat from his brow, and smiled. There were no confessions, no grand promises. Their feelings came like breath slow, real, and deep enough to warm the frozen parts of their hearts. One night, as he walked her back to the church gate, Jonas spoke softly. "Martha, I used to think I was too different for anyone to love." She looked at him and smiled so gently it felt like it was meant only for him. "No one is too different to be loved. Jonas, you only have to believe you deserve it." He remembered those words for the rest of his life. Their love didn't come from promises. It grew from long days of working side by side, believing together, and sharing silence. And when autumn came, the bell of Cedar Hollow rang once more, not to call people to prayer, but to witness two once lonely souls stand before God and take each other's hand. That autumn, Cedar Hollow was dressed in gold. The barley fields rippled under the wind, and birch leaves fluttered down along the dirt path leading to the church where the morning bell still rang faithfully, the sound that had long become the soul of the town. People said the bell sounded different now. Ever since Jonas Hale and Martha Collins began tending to it together, it didn't just mark the hour, it pulsed through the valley like a warm heartbeat. The heartbeat of two souls once wounded, now beating in harmony. No one knew exactly when Jonas and Martha chose to belong to one another. Perhaps it was one afternoon, building the fence around the orphanage. Perhaps one early morning, when she brought him a steaming cup of coffee at the forge. It happened the way dawn follows night, quietly, naturally, without announcement. One Sunday morning, after service ended, Reverend Charles Brooks asked everyone to remain. He stood at the wooden pulpit, his voice deep and warm. Today, I bring good news. 2 people who have helped heal this town now wish to walk forward together under God's witness and ours. Martha stood beside Jonas, their hands clasped. The church fell silent. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, laying soft light across her face, calm, gentle, a little trembling. Some people smiled, some nodded, a few cast doubtful glances. A woman in the back pew whispered, "He's far too tall. She's so small. They don't match at all." Jonas heard it, but this time he only smiled. Martha tightened her grip on his hand, as if to say it's all right. Then Reverend Brooks spoke clearly. True love isn't measured by appearances or talk. It is measured by faith. And sometimes, when 2 people believe in each other, the world changes a little. He turned to them. Jonas Hale, do you take Martha Collins as your life companion to love and protect her through sun and storm? And even on the coldest days, Jonas looked into Martha's eyes in which he had once seen his own loneliness reflected, and answered, slow and unwavering, I do. Not just today, but until this bell no longer rings. Martha's voice trembled as tears glimmered in her smile. And I do, because he didn't just rebuild the town's bell tower. He rebuilt the faith inside me. The bell rang. Reverend Brooks blessed them. The church burst into applause. Grant Porter, the old station master who had once seen Jonas humiliated at the station, stepped forward and shook his hand firmly. Well done, son. I told you if a man lives kindly, God will give him a place to belong. Outside, the orphanage children tossed wildflowers into the air. Samuel, the little boy who once asked Jonas about sadness, shouted Jonas married. Miss Martha, the bells ringing for their love. Laughter filled the courtyard, rising with the sound of the bell. The wedding feast was simple, held in the church's backyard. Long wooden tables draped in white cloth. Oil lamps hung along the porch beams. There was bread, smoked meat, apple cider. No instruments, just Martha's singing and the laughter of neighbors. Reverend Brooks said it was the truest wedding he'd ever seen. No extravagance. No pretense, only love and gratitude. That night, Jonas and Martha sat beneath the bell tower. Moonlight lay silver across the earth, and the wind made the bell tremble softly. Jonas spoke quietly. I used to think there was no place for me. But now, every time I hear this bell, I know I'm home. Martha rested her head on his shoulder and said softly, And I stopped looking for someone to fill the emptiness, because you didn't fill the empty space. Jonas, you made me forget it ever existed. They fell silent, then listening to the wind slip through the wooden beams. No more words were needed. Sometimes, silence is love's purest form. Below, the town slept, but atop the bell tower, the lamp still glowed, and perhaps from that night onward, Cedar Hollow was no longer just a small frontier town. It became the beginning of a new story, where 2 once broken souls finally found a home. Life after the wedding was not always easy, but in a small wooden house at the edge of the valley, when Martha lit the fire and Jonas forged iron in the morning light, people understood true love isn't in the wedding day, but in every day after, when 2 people choose to stay, no matter which way the wind blows. After the simple wedding beneath the bell tower, the life of Jonas Hale and Martha Collins quietly began not loud, not sweet in the way people often imagine love to be, but a steady rhythm of ordinary days, where affection was woven through work, sweat, and trust. Their wooden house stood on the eastern edge of Cedar Hollow, where winds from the snow-capped mountains swept across golden grasslands and disappeared into the open sky. Jonas built the house with his own hands, every beam, every stone, every wooden hinge crafted during the coldest winters of that year. Martha planted white daisies along the porch. She said, "I want the first thing you see when you come home to be the color of peace." Jonas only smiled. He had never thought someone would remember to plant flowers for him. Each morning, the sound of his hammer rang through the valley steady and strong, like a promise that he was still here, still building something more lasting than steel. And Martha, whose hands had once been burned by fire, now learned how to kindle the stove, bake bread, tend a small garden, and teach the orphans how to write their names. Both worked hard, yet within that labor were quiet moments of tenderness, moments only those who have known loss understand how to cherish. One morning, as the sun rose, Martha handed Jonas a handkerchief she hadn't finished embroidering. On it were 2 sparrows perched on a branch, and beneath them a line of stitching "Home is where 2 people dare to believe they belong." Jonas looked at it, his hand trembling slightly. She hadn't said it aloud, but he knew. By the end of summer, good news came. Martha was with child. Reverend Brooks was the first to know when she whispered it to him after Sunday service. He smiled, his old hand trembling slightly on her shoulder. God is never late with his beginnings. He just waits for hearts to grow strong enough to receive them. When Jonas heard the news, he stood motionless on the porch, his eyes brighter than they had ever been. He was silent for a long moment, then bent down and kissed his wife's hand, scarred, yet endlessly gentle. "I'll build a cradle for our child," he whispered. "Maybe it won't be the finest, but it will be the strongest thing I've ever made." From that day on, he worked in the forge from dawn to nightfall. The sounds of hammering, nails driving into wood, and the scent of burning pine filled the air. Martha would watch from the doorway, one hand resting on her belly, smiling the look of someone who knows they are living inside something true. The people of Cedar Hollow began to see in them the shape of a real family. Grant Porter, the station master, often passed by the forge and called inside Jonas. "I don't think I've seen anyone work as hard as you." But then again, when a man's got something to protect, he changes. Jonas wiped the sweat from his face and smiled. "You're right, Grant. I used to work just to survive. Now I work to keep what I love." In October, when the first cold winds blew in, the cradle was finished. It had no carvings, just a short inscription on the side emma, "Child of Light and Faith." Jonas chose the name, even though they didn't yet know if it was a boy or girl. Because, he said, light is something every child deserves. Winter came. Snow blanketed the roof. But inside their small home, the fire crackled and laughter lingered. Each night, Jonas forged tools to sell, and Martha sat by the window, knitting a blanket for the baby. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them was the most peaceful sound in the world. One night, as snow fell thicker than usual, Martha whispered through tired breath, "Jonas, I never thought I'd have this kind of happiness. There was a time I believed my heart had frozen forever." Jonas put down his hammer, walked to her, and wrapped his arms gently around her. "We've both been frozen before, Martha, but someone lit the fire again. Maybe it was God. Maybe it was us for each other." They stood quietly, listening to the wind outside, inside, their hands intertwined. Outside, the bell tower faded behind the curtain of snow, but the night bell still rang deep, steady, kind. When spring returned, little Emma cried for the first time. Her cry mingled with the sound of the bell and the hammer in the forge, marking the beginning of a new era. Not just for Jonas and Martha, but for all of Cedar Hollow. Because sometimes, true happiness isn't in grand things. It's in the moment a man knows, deep in his chest, that he finally has a home. Spring of 1891 came late that year. Snow clung stubbornly to the hills. Yet inside the small wooden house on the edge of Cedar Hollow, the laughter of a newborn child rose like silver bells, warm and bright. They named her Emma Hale, the very name Jonas had carved into the wooden cradle during the winter months before she came. And every time Emma laughed, Jonas felt something melt inside him, the cold of all the lonely years turning into gentle warmth. He still worked at the old forge, the one owned by Hugh Matheson, the town's oldest blacksmith, the man who took Jonas in during his first months here. Hugh was old now, his back slightly bent, but his grip was still firm whenever he held a hammer. He saw Jonas as the son he never had. One morning, while Jonas was stoking the fire, Hugh stepped into the forge, carrying the chill of dawn and the faint smell of tobacco. "You know, Jonas," he said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "I think it's time this forge had a new master." Jonas looked up, brows furrowed. "You mean?" Hugh nodded. "I'm leaving to live with my daughter in Montana. At my age, I can't keep wrestling iron in winter anymore. But this forge, it needs someone with a heart like yours. Not just strong hands." Jonas was silent for a long moment. The firelight flickered across his face, reflecting the emotion in his eyes. "I can't take it. Hugh, it's yours." Hugh smiled a wrinkled, warm smile. "No, Jonas, it was never mine. I was only keeping it for this town until someone brave enough to stay came along. And I think it's time you took root." Those words, "time to take root," struck something deep inside Jonas. For years, he had only known how to keep moving from the cold east to barren lands, from one disappointment to another fragile hope. And now, for the first time, he understood what it meant to stay. A few weeks later, the whole town gathered in front of the old forge. Reverend Brooks offered a blessing, and Hugh handed Jonas a hammer with a worn wooden handle. "Take it," he said. "It served me for 30 years. Now it's yours. But remember, a blacksmith doesn't just shape iron. He shapes the faith of a town." Jonas bowed his head, taking the hammer with calloused hands that trembled ever so slightly. His voice was low, but steady. "I promise I won't let this fire die." When Hugh left town, everyone walked with him to the train station. But no one remained sad for long, because they knew the man taking his place had been tested by honesty, patience, and love. From that day on, a new wooden sign hung above the door, "Hale's Forge." It was Martha who carved the name, her hand steady, her letters graceful. Beneath it she etched smaller words, "The Fire of Cedar Hollow." Work only grew from there. Jonas received orders from across the region: tools, horseshoes, hinges, even small bells for the new schoolhouse. He didn't just make things, he made life easier on the frontier. People said that whenever they heard the ring of Jonas's hammer, they felt at peace because it reminded them that some things remain steadfast in a changing world. At night, when the fire in the forge faded, Jonas would sit at the doorway with baby Emma asleep in his arms. Martha sat beside them, mending clothes. The glow from the dying embers lit their faces 3 small figures, full of quiet life. "You know," Martha said softly, "maybe this is what God wanted for us, not an easy life, but a place to love and to work." Jonas looked at Emma's sleeping face on his shoulder and nodded. "I used to fear I didn't belong anywhere. But now I understand home isn't where someone takes you in. It's where you build it with your own hands." Another evening, Reverend Brooks visited. He stood before the forge, listening to the steady hammering, and said, "Jonas, some people come here and then leave, leaving only dust behind. But you stayed, and from your hands, Cedar Hollow has found its soul." Jonas smiled. "I only do what I know how to do. Reverend, the soul of this town, that comes from everyone here." From then on, Jonas was no longer called the giant or the stranger. To everyone, he was the blacksmith of Cedar Hollow, the man they trusted with even the smallest things, a broken knife, a loose hinge, or sometimes a quiet request to mend their faith. That summer, the bell tower rang louder than ever, and each time it did, smoke from Jonas's forge rose into the sky bell, and fire meeting in the air, as if whispering the same truth. Life goes on, and kindness never cools. As time passed, the name Jonas Hale became as much a part of Cedar Hollow as the church bell or the creek running through the valley. But true acceptance doesn't always come from work. It comes from how a man lives among others. And one day, Jonas would realize he no longer needed to prove anything, because he was already accepted, simply by being here. The summer of 1892 bathed Cedar Hollow in soft golden light. From the top of the bell tower, one could see the barley fields bending with the wind, the silver stream curling around the foothills, and thin smoke rising from wooden rooftops, signs of a town that was truly alive. Through all of it, the steady rhythm of hammer against iron echoed from Jonas Hale's forge. Each strike on the heated metal was like the heartbeat of Cedar Hollow itself. People said that as long as they could hear that hammer, they knew Jonas was there keeping the town's fire from going out. Since Hugh Matheson left, Jonas was no longer just the blacksmith. He had become a part of the town's soul. He shoed horses for the farmers, forged hinges for the schoolhouse, and even cast small bells for the new chapel in the southern valley. No one called him the stranger from the east or the giant anymore. To them, he was simply Jonas of Cedar Hollow. But what made Jonas happiest wasn't the town's respect. It was the way Martha and little Emma waited for him every evening on the porch. When he arrived, Emma would run toward him, tripping over her small dress, laughing wide, "Papa's home. I heard your hammer from far away." And in that moment, Jonas knew every hardship, every year of rejection and mockery, had turned to ash. One day, Reverend Charles Brooks visited the forge. He carried a letter from the town council inviting Jonas to speak at the 3-year anniversary of the bell tower's rebuilding. "We want you to say a few words," the Reverend said gently. "Not about God, about the human heart." Jonas hesitated. He had never seen himself as a man meant for speeches, but the Reverend laid a hand on his shoulder and smiled. "You don't have to speak well. You just have to speak true." The ceremony took place in the late afternoon. As sunlight spilled over the bell tower and the whole town gathered in the square, a banjo played somewhere. Children laughed, and people brought pies, apple cider, and wild daisies as offerings of gratitude. When Reverend Brooks called Jonas forward, applause spread through the crowd. He walked slowly, tall and steady in the golden light. He held no paper. He simply looked toward the old bell tower, the place where everything had begun. "I came to Cedar Hollow with nothing but 2 empty hands," he began, voice low but strong, and a heart already in pieces. I didn't come here to be loved. I only wanted a place where I could work, a place where I wouldn't make anyone feel out of place." He paused, glancing at Martha holding Emma in the front row. "But here, I learned something that no one is truly a stranger if they choose to be kind. And kindness, even the smallest kind, can change the way the world looks at you." The crowd was silent. Only the wind moved through the rooftops, and then the bell rang softly, like an answer. After the ceremony, many came to shake his hand. Among them was a face Jonas never expected to see again: Clara Whitmore, the mail-order bride who once rejected him. She looked different now, silver strands in her hair, a slender figure, and eyes stripped of pride. "Jonas," she said, voice trembling, I've heard about all you've done. I was wrong. When I saw you back then, I saw only a man whose size frightened me. But now I know I should have looked at a man's heart, not his height." Jonas studied her for a moment, then gave a faint smile. "There's nothing to forgive. Clara, I was afraid of myself, too. Maybe we were both just trying to survive our loneliness." She bowed her head, tears slipping quietly, then stepped back to let him return to the crowd. Reverend Brooks, having witnessed it all, turned to Grant Porter, the old station master. "Some people seek revenge with their words," the Reverend murmured, but Jonas answered with his life. "Sometimes that is the truest victory." Grant nodded, eyes reflecting the bell tower, glowing in the sunset. "He didn't just rebuild the bell tower, Reverend. He rebuilt our faith. That evening, as Jonas walked home, he lifted little Emma into his arms and pointed toward the bell tower in the distance. Hear that, Emma? That bell will still ring, even when I'm gone, because it belongs to everyone who believes that being kind is enough." Martha looked at him, eyes glistening but peaceful. "I think Cedar Hollow isn't just a town anymore. It's a reminder that anyone can begin again if they dare to open their heart." Jonas squeezed her hand gently and replied, "And sometimes beginning again doesn't mean going somewhere far. It means staying where your heart feels safe." Outside, the summer wind swept across the fields. The bell rang softly, mixing with Emma's laughter in her father's arms. Years later, people would still speak of Jonas and Martha not as a grand romance, but as a quiet love that endured. For they did not choose each other out of need, nor pity, but because they saw something in the other that made them want to be better. And that is the truest nature of love, a choice, not charity. That autumn, the fields around Cedar Hollow shimmered in golden hues, like a vast blanket laid beneath a clear sky. Wind drifted down from the snow-capped mountains, carrying the first chill of the season and the faint smell of wood smoke from the valley homes. Amid that peaceful setting, the life of Jonas Hale and Martha Collins moved gently forward, not dramatic, not loud, but steady, like the quiet breath of someone who has finally found where they belong. Jonas still worked at the forge every day, his calloused hands steady and skilled. Martha continued teaching the orphans how to write their letters, and little Emma, now old enough to walk, would run about, picking up metal scraps and bringing them to her father, giggling, "Papa, can this be made into a little bell?" Jonas would ruffle her hair, his smile as warm as late autumn sunlight. To him, happiness wasn't something grand. It was simply turning around and seeing the people he loved waiting there. But on some nights, after the hammering ceased and only the dying glow of the forge remained, Jonas would sit quietly, eyes lingering on the long scar along his right wrist, a remnant of an old accident, a mark he once saw as something shameful, something that made him different. And Martha, she, too, bore scars across her left arm, the burn marks from that winter when she saved 2 children from a burning house. One night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Jonas' hand brushed against the scar on Martha's arm. His hand paused. She looked at him not with avoidance, but with gentle calm. "You know, Jonas," she said softly, "I used to hate this scar. It reminded me of fire, of screaming, of fear. But then I thought without it, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have met you." Jonas lowered his head and kissed the scar as though he was kissing a piece of her past. "I used to think," he whispered, "that without the things that hurt me, I wouldn't be broken. But now I know without them, I wouldn't understand love. We don't love each other because of what's perfect, but because of what shaped us," Martha finished, her voice trembling faintly, yet warm. In that moment, they looked at each other, not with gratitude alone, but with the understanding of 2 souls who chose each other, knowing it might hurt, knowing life would never be flawless. One early winter morning, snow falling thick and quiet, Jonas helped Reverend Brooks repair the church roof, where the wind had loosened the bell rafters. While they rested, the Reverend watched him for a while and said, "Jonas, true love isn't accepting someone despite their flaws, but because of them. In God's eyes, we are all unfinished, still being forged." Jonas looked up and smiled. "I think loving someone is like blacksmithing, Reverend, not to make them perfect, but to help them become stronger with every fire they endure." The Reverend nodded, hands trembling slightly from the cold. "You're right. You and Martha, you don't try to change each other. You let each other be yourselves. And that is the kind of love the world rarely sees." That evening, when Jonas returned home, he found Martha standing on the porch, wiping the window glass. Sunset lay across her hair, turning it the color of honey. He stood there for a moment just to take in the sight of a woman once wounded, once alone, now standing in the home they had built together. He walked to her and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "I've been thinking," he said. She smiled. "Another blacksmith philosophy." He shook his head. "No, something I see in you. You never pitied me even when I had nothing. You chose to stay, even when you could have walked away. And because of that, every day, I feel like the luckiest man alive." Martha turned, looking at him for a long moment, then placed her hand over his heart. "Jonas, love isn't finding someone to fix. It's finding someone you don't have to hide from. I chose you not because you're perfect, but because with you, I feel like I can be myself." Jonas remembered those words for the rest of his life, because in that simple truth, he understood real love doesn't save us. It just opens the door so we can save ourselves. And whenever people asked him the secret to happiness, he only smiled and said, "We don't try to make each other happy. We just try to be kind to each other every single day." One day, when Martha noticed strands of gray in her hair, she said softly, "We've gone farther than I ever dreamed we would." Jonas squeezed her hand, his gaze tender. "It's not luck, Martha. It's because we chose each other again and again, even when it would have been easier to let go. And that was the truest, simplest thing. Love isn't a miracle. It is a series of choices made with courage. The story of Jonas and Martha isn't just a love story. It is a reminder that people don't need to be perfect to be worthy of love. We only need to be brave enough to choose each other and stay even when leaving would be easier. Because in that choice, we find our true worth." In the years that followed, Cedar Hollow changed. A new railroad line cut through the valley, bringing the echo of train whistles and unfamiliar faces. Children now studied in a red brick schoolhouse, and the elders gathered each evening on the saloon porch, speaking of old times as if they were the foundation stones of memory. And through it all, the name Jonas Hale slowly became inseparable from the town. No one spoke any more of the day he was mocked, or how he was once the stranger from the East. Instead, they spoke of him as the man who rebuilt Cedar Hollow from ashes. Every time the bell tower rang the same tower he had helped raise in the early days, people remembered there are some who come into the world not to stand out, but to make it stronger. One late autumn afternoon, Jonas sat on the porch, a warm cup of tea in his hands. Little Emma sat in his lap and asked Papa, "Why does everyone in town know your name?" Jonas smiled and brushed her hair back. "Not everyone knows, sweetheart. They only remember what I've done." "But you didn't do anything big," she said, eyes wide. Jonas looked out toward the bell tower, bathed in golden sunlight. "Sometimes, doing the right thing, even if it's small, can change the way the world works." Emma blinked, then nodded thoughtfully, as if she understood something large and quiet. Martha stepped onto the porch, carrying a freshly knitted shawl. She draped it gently over Jonas' shoulders and said, "You've taught her something I first learned from you, that we don't need to shrink ourselves to fit someone else's eyes. I think that's the greatest thing our daughter could carry with her." Jonas was silent for a while, then smiled softly. "I didn't teach anything. I just lived and hoped she would understand. On this frontier land, where everyone carried their own private scars." Jonas had proven that a person's worth wasn't measured by how they looked, but by what they did. He didn't preach, didn't boast, but people felt something in him: patience, honesty, and the ability to make ordinary days meaningful. Cedar Hollow had once been a forgotten settlement in the windswept plains, but because of people like Jonas, it became a place with bells, with laughter, and with children who dared to dream beyond the borders they'd been given. Years later, when Reverend Brooks passed away, the townsfolk built a small memorial beside the bell tower. Etched into the stone were the words he once said to Jonas: "A man doesn't need to shout to change the world. He only needs to live kindly enough that others want to be better." And so it was. Jonas never tried to prove his worth with words. He worked. He loved. He helped and let his life speak for him. One winter day, a stranger arrived in Cedar Hollow, a tired woman with silver-threaded hair. It was Clara Whitmore, the woman who had once rejected Jonas. She stood a long time in front of the forge, staring at the wooden sign that read "Hale's Forge, the Fire of Cedar Hollow." When she finally spoke to Jonas, her voice was soft. "You did what I never had the courage to do. Stay." Jonas didn't blame her, didn't offer lofty forgiveness. He simply answered, "Sometimes, staying doesn't take courage, just believing you're worthy of the place you choose." That sentence became one of the most repeated stories in town, because it captured the essence of Jonas' journey from rejected to ridiculed, to the man who rebuilt a community not with bitterness, but with patience and quiet faith. When spring returned, Jonas' forge became a place children loved to visit. He taught them how to hold a hammer, how to read the fire, and more importantly, how to respect the work they did. "Every strike of the hammer tells a story," he would say, "and that story will outlive the one who forged it." To the people of Cedar Hollow, Jonas became the living proof of that story, a story about endurance, kindness, and belief. From calloused-handed farmers to the young school teacher in town, everyone understood. You cannot choose where you are born, but you can choose how you live. And it is that way of living slow, honest, steadfast, that becomes the soul of the frontier. Years later, when Jonas's hair had turned silver, people still saw him sitting on the porch, weathered hands cradling a grandchild, eyes kind as they were the first day he stepped into Cedar Hollow. Beside him, Martha still smiled, and the bell tower still rang every morning and evening. They didn't live extraordinary lives, only kind ones, and that was enough for the world to remember them. Time passed like water threading through stone, quiet, unstoppable. More than 20 years had gone by since Jonas Hale first set foot in Cedar Hollow. The small town nestled against the snow-capped mountains. From a harsh and lonely settlement, Cedar Hollow had changed. Now there was a railway line crossing the valley each week, a school of red brick, the largest forge in the region, and every evening the sun still set in golden light across the bell tower Jonas had helped raise. That afternoon, the breeze was gentle. The sky was so clear one could trace every pale cloud drifting across it. Jonas sat in an old wooden chair on the porch, the very one he had carved with his own hands, etched with the words Hale Family, 1891. Beneath it, 2 new names had been added over the years, Emma and Samuel. Emma, their firstborn, was now a young woman. Samuel, their youngest, had his father's bright eyes and eager hands. Martha came out with a steaming cup of tea. Her hair was silvered now, but her eyes still held that quiet kindness, the same look that once stopped Jonas on the day he thought this place was only a station to pass through. "Do you remember," she said softly, "on your first day here, you told me Cedar Hollow was so small that even the wind had nowhere to hide?" Jonas chuckled. The slow, gentle laugh of a man who knew that time could never take away what truly belonged to him. "Now I think," he replied, "it was that smallness that kept me here. In a big world, people lose each other too easily. Here, I only have to turn my head to see you." They sat in silence for a while. In the distance, the bell tower rang low and warm, just as it always had, carrying with it the quiet belief that even in a changing world, there was still room for kindness. Emma, their daughter, now a school teacher, walked up with 2 fair-haired children clinging to her hands. "Mama, Papa," she said, "I taught the children about Cedar Hollow's history today." One of them asked who built the bell tower. Jonas smiled. "And what did you say?" Emma answered. "Gently I said it was a man who came here with empty hands and a patient heart." Martha tilted her head, eyes full of pride and quiet feeling. "Did you tell them he was once rejected and laughed at Emma?" Nodded, "Yes. I told them that's why he understands kindness better than most." Jonas watched his grandchildren playing on the porch steps, a feeling rising inside him that words could not quite hold. Maybe it was peace, a kind of peace only those who have walked through storms can truly recognize. He glanced toward the forge at the end of the road. "Now!" Samuel tended the fires. The sound of his hammer rang strong, not the rhythm of a man searching for a place to belong, but the rhythm of someone who already did. "Papa," Samuel had said the day before, when I finish making the new bell pedal, "I want to carve your name into it." Jonas had smiled and clapped a hand on his son's shoulder. "You don't need to carve my name. If the bell still rings, then I'm still there." That evening, the family gathered around the fireplace. Outside, the wind blew harder and snowflakes drifted through the air, but inside, the flames glowed warmly across the faces of 3 generations of the Hale family. Martha held Jonas's hand. Their skin was wrinkled now, like small rivers running toward a single quiet sea. "Do you ever think," she whispered, "that all of this began with just one letter?" Jonas nodded. "Yes, a letter from someone who never really read my heart. And yet, because of it, I found you." They laughed low, soft laughter, simple as breath. There was no bitterness left, no regret, Only gratitude for the way's loss had cleared a path toward love. Outside, the snow began to fall thicker. Jonas stood, pulled on his coat, and stepped onto the porch. He looked toward the bell tower, where a faint golden light shone through the snow. "You know," he said quietly, as if speaking to the night, or to himself all my life, "I thought I was too big for this world. But now I know if you have a place to love, and to be loved, no one is too big or too small." Martha came beside him, slipped an arm around his back. "You were never too big, Jonas," she whispered. "You were just strong enough to love the right way." That sentence simple, but carrying a lifetime within it. And if someone had passed through Cedar Hollow that winter, they might have seen something they would never forget under a sky of falling snow. 3 generations of the Hale family standing together beside a bell tower and a forged symbols of perseverance, of faith, and of love that refused to yield. No grand speeches, no music, just light, warmth, and the quiet stillness of a beautiful ending where every beginning found its peace. And so, the story of Jonas Hale came to a close, not with the roar of fate, but with the gentle breath of peace. They once said he was too tall to be loved, yet Cedar Hollow remembered him as the man strong enough to love the right way. For sometimes, the most beautiful thing in this world is not to be chosen, but to have the courage to stay, even when no one promises you will be loved. There are stories that don't need grand tragedies to touch the heart, only a simple soul who chooses kindness over bitterness, who chooses to stay instead of walking away. The story of Jonas Hale, a man once rejected for being too different, is not just a love story. It is a quiet reminder of the power of belief and perseverance. Jonas never sought pity. He simply chose to live kindly, work with his whole heart, and love with quiet sincerity. And because of that, the entire town of Cedar Hollow changed. Because when one person lives with patient goodness, they don't just change their own fate, they reignite faith in the hearts of others. The message of this story is simple, yet profound. You don't have to shrink yourself to fit someone else's expectation. Just live truthfully, do what's right, and love with a heart unafraid of being hurt, and sooner or later, you will find the place where you truly belong. If this story made you pause for a moment, or made you smile quietly in the middle of a busy day, then maybe somewhere inside you there is a small flame like Jonah's, quiet, steady, and unbreakable. Thank you for listening, for walking this journey of love and kindness with Frontier Hearts. If you believe that beautiful stories still deserve to be told, please like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts. So together, we can keep this little flame burning in a world that sometimes forgets that kindness, too, is a form of courage.